This podcast is crazy. Former president of Y Combinator, a former no need for explanation whatsoever. He's the man who succeeded actually Sam Altman after he left Y Combinator and joined. And sadly, in this conversation, I was supposed to join much earlier on, but the software app asked for a Google update. In fact, just when I was about to join, I managed to get one question on the end. But this is hosted by my best friend Burke. So we really, really hope that you enjoy the video.
Geoff, welcome to the Builders and Funders Show. Nice to be here, Burke. Awesome. I want to start by taking you down memory lane a little bit. You started out at Hewlett Packard as an engineer, and in an interview you gave to Dartmouth College, you mentioned that after you quit your job, between the period of quitting your job and going to work at 411, there was a period where you launched a few startups. I never actually found any kind of clip of you talking about what that period was actually like. If you could you take us back to that day? Like, you just quit your job, you want to build startups. What was that process like between quitting and joining 401? What were those startups? I had always meant to quit my job at HP and start a startup. And I'd done a lot of talking about it, but no doing. We used to go to this bar called PJ Mulligan's on Friday night for happy hour when I was just a kid working at HP, and we would talk about the startups we were going to start, but there wasn't much infrastructure on starting startups. And so even though we talked a lot about it, no one really knew what to do or how to do it. You'd hear about people starting things, having ideas and going off and doing things. And, everyone still back in the day talked about Jobs and Wozniak starting Apple and what it was like and how they did it. And I worked at HP, and Bill and David started HP famously in a garage in Palo Alto with something like $418 in their pockets. That was their original venture capital. So it was a thing, but no one really knew what to do about it. And so I went through a whole bunch of things. I moved to France. I lived there for almost 5 years. I got 2 different degrees, all while still essentially being with HP. And I came home a little bit with my tail between my legs thinking, well, what am I doing now? Like, I never left HP. I'm in my 30s. I'm old. Seems funny now. Maybe not from your perspective. 30 probably seems old from this perspective of someone who's 18. But from my perspective right now, it seems a little crazy. But I felt like I was old and I had never left HP. And then a friend of mine called me up and said that I haven't talked in a long time. We were catching up. He said, "Hey, have you seen Mosaic?" And I said, "Mosaic? Never heard of it. What are you talking about?" He said, "Yeah, it's really cool." I said, "Well, what does it do?" He said, "It helps you look at the internet." And I said, "What are you talking about? Like, is it a protocol analyzer?" That's the way I thought. I was a network engineer at the time. You look at the internet? What does it even mean? He said, I don't know. You should just get it. So I got it. It wasn't easy actually at the time. And I had to do all sorts of stuff to be able to get out of the local internet in my company, because that wasn't a thing really back then, but you could do it. And I saw Mosaic, which was of course the first browser, not the first browser, but the first browser that integrated text and graphics together, built by Mark Andreessen and company at NCSA in Illinois. And I was like, holy shit, this is new. This is different. This is what I've been waiting for. And I quit my job 3 weeks later. And I still remember my manager at the time, who randomly was a French guy, Patrick. I won't tell you his full name, Patrick. And Patrick looked at me and said, "Well, what are you doing? Where are you going?" And I said, "I don't know. This is my future. I'm starting something. I don't know what it's happening, man. This internet World Wide Web thing is happening." And he looked at me and said, "Let me give you some advice. Never, ever, ever leave a job without having another job lined up." Very French. And I said, "Okay, but I'm sorry, I'm leaving a job." And I've left maybe 3 or 4 jobs since then. I've never had a job like it's always worked out. So I've done exactly the opposite of that advice. But it was complicated because I didn't really have a job, and this thing that called the World Wide Web was nascent, and I would drive around Palo Alto. I've told this story many times with my girlfriend, now my wife, and we would see a URL every now and then, just a URL like on a sign. And I said, "Look, it's real." And she would be like, "Yeah, right." But, it was hard. And I did start a bunch of companies. And in fact, one of the companies I merged into 411, I started a company called Lookup, which was a really good name for a search engine. I was a search engine for email addresses, and I built a free web page product into Lookup, and 411 had similar products. So we merged it together, and I became part of 411, and later we were bought by Yahoo, and a variety of mostly good things happened. Not all good, but mostly good things happened after that.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated with this question of when to pivot versus persist. And I think it's highly contextual, but I think when you joined 401, at that point, there was no Rocket Mail, there was no mail provider. It was just a directory of email addresses. And I think in an interview you gave, you said you kind of had this like epiphany of what if we built a web-based, email provider instead? Like this could work out. What were the kind of signs you were looking at that were kind of telling you, oh, it's maybe time to pivot? Why did you choose to pivot at that very moment instead of just persist and keep building this directory?
Well, we had a really good directory and it was working pretty well, and we had some customers, but it was the most unsticky thing you could possibly imagine. People would come in once a month. There was no context really. We couldn't really sell advertising. We had no future by trying to be the white pages of the internet. It turns out the white pages of the internet wasn't really a thing. It wasn't really this unique thing. Even the yellow pages kind of started to become a thing, but then didn't. There was a bunch of people famous, like there was a thing called Big Book that Yahoo offered to buy for like $40 million. And they turned it down because they thought they had a thing, and it ended up being sold for like less than $500,000. It just didn't work. And Elon's first company, Zip2, was kind of a thing, but it got sold for like $20 million. Nothing, right? It's not how he became the richest man in the world. So we had really nowhere to go, and it became pretty clear. And it was also pretty clear that web-based email was a thing. And we were trying to do deals with Hotmail, and they were just super difficult. And at one point I realized, wait, we can build a better web-based email than they have. And that's going to be something that will be sticky, that will matter to people more than this directory. So we have all the ability to do it. Let's do that. And I persuaded my colleagues at 401 to do web-based email. And so that we sort of kicked this off in October of 1996. And by February of 1997, and that was an intense 4 months, like intense. We had built web-based email and launched. And within 7 months, we had 500,000 actually, lot more sense, but 500,000 actual users, which was a lot back then. And Yahoo bought us to build Yahoo Mail.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Then, you stick around at Yahoo for a while, become the chief product officer, and then you left to create Lala Media. Could you tell us the story of the Facebook music deal at Lala Media and what happened?
Yeah, I actually left to find my next thing, and I was an angel investor for 18 months, and I was the founding investor with an old friend at Lala, and eventually brought me on as CEO and said, okay, you can be founder CEO since you were here in the beginning. So I was a sort of founder of Lala because the co-founder and I had been talking about founding a company, and he just jumped first, and then I did a bunch of things and then came back with him. And I guess the end of 2008, 2009, Facebook decided they wanted to create something called Facebook Music, and they did a bit of a bake-off to see who was going to be Facebook Music. And there was this company called iLike, run by the Partovi brothers, that was doing really well, but had kind of a contentious relationship with Facebook. And we were in the bake-off with them and a couple other companies, and then we won. So Facebook chose Lala for a variety of reasons. And we had a great team, a great product, and we weren't. It turned out it was incredibly complicated to get this deal done. The most complicated deal I've ever seen. We had to do a deal with Facebook, with every music label to be able to play the music on the site, and then with a whole host of music publishers. It was super complicated. There were a million moving parts, but we got almost the whole thing done. We got all the labels on board. We were like that, just the 2-yard line with Facebook, and Zuck canceled it. He killed it. He decided he didn't like the whole thing. And that was like, we had really bet the company on this deal. And when it didn't happen, it could have been the death knell for the company. But it wasn't, because what happened, two things happened a little late. First of all, we had to sort of, reinvigorate the company and rebuild the morale of the company. We were small. We were about 30 people. And that was hard, but we did it. We kept going because we had a really good product and a lot of users and a lot of growth. And then we did 2 deals. We did a deal that integrated us very tightly into Google's search, and we did a deal actually with Facebook to integrate into their new store that they were building. And that made us like the hottest thing in music. And then we got acquired by Apple. Thanks to that. Mostly because I think they didn't want Google to acquire us. And Google should have acquired us, but they kind of blew the deal. So we had competition from Google and Apple and Nokia, I believe, to buy us. But in the end,
A lot of times when the big deals like that fall through and they almost cause the death of the company, as you mentioned, morale is down, and a lot of times like self-doubt starts to creep in sometimes. You start to think, oh, maybe I sucked. Maybe like this was my fault. And you start to take a little bit of responsibility. Now, in the lecture at Y Combinator, you mentioned you were like, at moments like they'll just default to action. But I'm sure at that point, you're a relatively young man. I mean, you still don't have the full hindsight you have today. How did you take it personally? I mean, like what was that exact moment like when you received the news? How did you boost your own morale? Was there a quote? I know you play tennis. Did you like go and play a bunch of tennis to try and de-stress? Like, what were you doing to stay sane in that very moment?
yeah, I don't know that I remember. I remember, you said, I remember that, yeah, I guess if I'm remembering correctly, I was mixed, actually. I was actually not that sad that it didn't happen, because I remember that it was the kind of deal that I always advise startups not to do. And I've learned a lot since then, and I don't know if I would have advised them then, but if I was advising myself, then I would have said, run the heck away from that deal, because they almost never work. And they never do what you think they're going to do. But I felt that. I felt like this was like a make the company kind of deal. So we had to do it once we won, but it was kind of like the dog catching the bus, because we caught the bus. And often when you catch that bus, it does more damage to you. You do it. And it did. In fact, we didn't really know that Zuck was brought into this, and we didn't know the deal was going to go through. And we didn't even know if it happened that it would really be that great for the company. Maybe, maybe not, but it was certainly sucking up all of our resources because we're small and Facebook is huge. And so I kind of felt like, oh my God, that's a big blow. Thank God. Thank God, because now we're free. I kind of remember feeling a little bit the way I felt like when we got the deal, like when we got bought by Yahoo at Formula One. I didn't want that deal. I was like, oh my God, we're doing so well. Why are we going to be bought by Yahoo? That's terrible. We ended up getting bought, and it was okay. It was fine. And it worked out well for me in the end. But it felt like, oh my God, we have so much potential. And I felt that way about Lala too. And it was still a blow, but there was definitely an undercurrent of thank you. Thank you, Zach.
Absolutely. And I got to give credit to my mentor, Matt Orr, for this question. I was talking to him and I mentioned that you'd be on the show, and he had this kind of question. Often a lot of successful people in their toughest times, and building a startup is hard. You've went through a lot of things. They often have some kind of maybe quote or just some memory, something that they hold on to that they maybe repeat to themselves, either from book, movie, maybe a family or friend said something to them and they just have that memory. Is there anything that you have like that you've always like remembered or held on to in your toughest moment in building startups?
Uh, I came to believe that the future is really hard to predict, and that you can't be so sure that what's ever happening to you is not the best possible thing, even if it seems really bad. And so I try to keep that in mind. There were a few times, like when I kind of glossed over merging with 411, and what that was like for me, but that was a huge failure for me. I had tried to start my own company, and I kind of failed at it, and it felt terrible because it's hard to be a solo founder, and I'm not a very good solo founder. As it turns out, I need a co-founder. I need that moral support, the psychological support, because when you're down, the other person can hopefully be up and lift you. And it's hard to do things all by yourself. And it felt like failure. And when I joined 401, it felt like failure, and I hated it. And I said, what am I doing here? Like in the beginning, it was just terrible. And finally I just got into the work, and I just worked my butt off, and it worked out. But it turned out that it worked out really well. It wasn't a disaster. It worked out really well. Hard to predict that then. When Facebook failed, that ended up being the best possible, that deal failed. That was the best possible thing. And so I've always tried to keep in mind that even when things seem to be turning downhill, you can't predict how that's going to impact the future. So you make the best of every possible situation, work your butt off, and things are more likely to turn out good than bad if you do that, if you have that right approach. And I've tried to keep that front and center as like we all do. We all go through, there's no smooth, easy glide path through life. You have ups and downs, and just try to recognize there's ups and downs. But as long as the general trajectory is the right direction, you'll do okay.
There's Brian Chesky and Alexander Wang, famous founders that been a part of Y Combinator. I'm curious, what were some of the relatively unknown, or maybe just unknown at all, founders that you've encountered through your journey, throughout your life, and what made them stand out to you, and what were their stories?
That's a particularly hard question to answer in a very short time on, because as you can imagine, I've met thousands of founders, and there are so many that stand out that trying to search through that file and think through who's worth stand out is tough. But there are a few people who were pretty cool. I mean, I'll name one founder who has, and this is not like the one. And so if he, by some weird chance, hears this, you're not the one, Blake, but you are pretty special. So I'll mention Blake Scholl. And it's because he's kind of an outlier in that we funded him, and he's not sort of, what his idea wasn't, mainstream YC kind of idea. Even though we funded a broad variety of things, he's more on the outlier. He said, there hasn't been a supersonic jet built commercially since the Concorde, and it was mostly designed in the 1950s. That's weird because, it's like 2015 now. What do we do? And we should be able to build an incredible supersonic jet. And there's so we're like, oh, so you are an aeronautics engineer? No, I'm a software guy. Like, really? But Blake has gone on to build aerospace, has successfully built a supersonic jet. It's a one-person jet, but they're in process of building their commercial jet, which they hope to have in production by 2029. It's amazing. What an amazing story. He went from that like crazy interview and beginning at YC to actually building a supersonic aerospace company from nothing, from an idea, from a belief system. And I think there are many extraordinary founders that I could talk about, but I think that's just such an outlier story that it's worth pointing out. But again, it's a tough question to answer quickly. But he's a good example of someone to follow. How did he do something so ridiculously hard? By the way, Boom hasn't made it yet. They're not like massively profitable because they have to roll out their new jet, but they're doing incredibly well, and they're many years into with a lot of success.
Awesome. Geoff, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.